Food is likely the best part of being alive. No other pleasure is enjoyed multiple times a day and never grows old. It's an expression of culture, of our parents' love, and a means of celebration and comfort. That's why it's so bothersome when we're told we need to change what and how we eat to combat rapid climate change. One of the tastiest foods, meat, has one of the worst reputations. It doesn't help that the topic is really hard to research due to its complexity and emotionally charged discussions. But surely science can give us an answer! The reality is, it's complicated. Let's look at 3 frequently used climate arguments against meat and see where they lead. 1. Does our diet really have such a big impact on climate change? Feeding billions is impossible without causing emissions. Even if one day we have emission-free tractors, refrigerators, stoves using renewable energy, and electric trucks to transport our food, there are still unavoidable emissions. Rice emits methane. We clear forests for pastures and plantations. We emit nitrous oxide when we use fertilizers and manure. Global food production is responsible for around 26% of all greenhouse gas emissions from human activities. It's regrettable since food isn't optional. Even if 26% doesn't seem that bad, it would mean that even if we eliminated all other emissions today, food production emissions alone would use up our entire carbon budget by 2100. So no matter how we look at it, food remains a driver in climate change. But still, emissions from different foods vary widely. How do things look when we compare the footprints of each? The climate impact of food is typically based on life cycle analyses, an examination that takes into account all the emissions of a product throughout its existence, from production to transport, packaging, use, and waste management. In the most detailed meta-analysis of life cycle analyses to date, beef emissions top the chart. On average, a kilogram of beef emits 71 kg of CO2 equivalent. Lamb also ranks high at 40 kg. Pork emits 12 and chicken 10 kg. At the bottom, we have various plant foods. Potatoes, for example, emit about 150 times less than beef. But the most important aspect of food isn't weight. It's nutritional density. A kilogram of meat will keep you alive much longer than a kilogram of potatoes. So how does the ranking change if we compare emissions per calorie or protein? Not much. Animal protein is still the most environmentally costly, and beef and lamb continue to be outliers in emissions per calorie. But is this fair? After all, not all meat is created equal. There are various ways to raise cattle, from solely grass-fed to intensive farming. The worst meat reaches 105 kilos of emissions per 100 grams of protein, the best only 9, a tenfold difference. In contrast, most other foods, especially vegetables, have a much more limited spectrum. But the best steak is still worse than the worst plant. Okay, but this seems promising. Can we then buy the best meat and reduce our emissions? Perhaps by purchasing locally produced meat to minimize the impact? 2. Does buying local food really matter? Let's stick with beef since it's so far off the curve. Buying locally, you're trying to avoid emissions from transportation and packaging. But this only accounts for 0.5 to 2% of the total emissions from meat. In fact, transportation and packaging combined are around 11% of all food emissions. Almost all of the food transport emissions are produced in the last kilometers, regional trips to supply markets and stores in your area. International food transport almost exclusively happens by cargo ships, which are ridiculously efficient. For instance, to ship a kilogram of avocados from South America to Europe generates about 0.3 As of CO2 equivalent in transport emissions and about 2.5 As in total, while a kilogram of the best meat from your local butcher generates at least 18 kilos of CO2 equivalent. So even when shipped long distances, emissions from almost all plant food are lower than locally produced meat. Okay, then if transport isn't such a big deal, what causes the large number of emissions from meat? By far, the largest chunk of meat emissions consists of methane released directly by the animals. While CO2 stays in the atmosphere for centuries, methane only remains for a few decades. But in that short period, it's very powerful. Altogether, methane has caused 23 to 40% of all warming generated by humans. There's controversy over how bad this is, but we won't go into that here. But as it stands, any more emissions aren't good news. Even so, all cows burp and fart more or less the same. What explains the variation in emissions? Several different factors. It matters whether the meat comes from a dairy herd or one dedicated exclusively to meat production. 44% of the world's cattle come from dairy cows, sharing their footprint with dairy products. Dairy cows usually receive better feed, which makes them grow faster and emit less methane. Geography also has its impact, as it determines the possible breeding methods. The worst factor by far is the destruction of forests to become pasture. In addition to releasing CO2 that was trapped in the flora, It also releases carbon trapped in the soil and destroys its ability to capture carbon in the future. This aspect represents the greatest variety in meat emissions. The worst emitters are farms burning tropical forests, especially in Brazil. There's a sinister truth hidden here. The more an animal suffers, the better it is for climate change, as they are much more efficient. They use less land and the food is brought directly to them, so they grow faster and don't expend as much energy on things like walking. Intensively farmed cattle that never walk on pasture end up being less harmful to the climate than cattle grazing peacefully on a pasture that was once a tropical forest. But isn't it a bit unrealistic to demonize cattle this way? Part of the land these animals graze on isn't suitable for cultivation anyway. Grazing, they can transform things we can't digest into food. Isn't raising animals just a clever way to make the best use of these resources? 3. Isn't the land used by cattle mostly unusable for agriculture and other things? Nearly half of the non-arid, ice-free land on the planet is used for agriculture, an area the size of all of America plus China. Half of that land is dedicated to raising animals. The majority of this is pasture, 65% of which cannot be converted to plantations. So grazing animals are quite efficient at using these areas since we can't grow human food there anyway. There are some catches to this. While the idea that cattle turn useless grass into beef is cool, it's a marketing lie. Despite being so huge, pastures alone cannot support the ruminants that live on them. Globally, pasture only sustains 13% of meat production. So if we switch to 100% grass-fed meat, we'd have to eat much less meat. In the US, beef production would fall about 70% if it depended exclusively on pasture. The only way to sustain high demand for meat is to grow food for our livestock. And we haven't even talked about chickens and pigs, which rely exclusively on this feed. Because of all this demand for feed, less than half of the world's cereals are used as human food. 41% is used for animals. The same is true for soy. There's a lot of talk about deforestation in the Amazon to produce soy, which makes us think of soy milk and tofu. But only 19% of global soy production is used for human products. About 77% is used to feed animals. Moreover, land without plantations isn't automatically ecologically useless. A meatless diet would free up to 2 billion hectares. A vegan diet about 3 billion hectares of land. We could use this land to plant forests or restore wild fields. Basically anything that sucks carbon from the atmosphere. If we reserved 3 billion hectares of land, we could remove about 800 billion tons of CO2 from the air in just over 100 years. In comparison, we currently emit about 50 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Okay, let's summarize. Food is a major driver of emissions. Meat, especially beef, is the worst food in terms of emissions. Buying locally doesn't solve the big impact of food emissions compared to the type of food you consume. When it comes to beef, grass-fed cattle can even be counterproductive because they need much more land. Even if you found the most eco-friendly steak in the world, your burger would still have a much larger carbon footprint than a vegetable burger. You can decide for yourself what you want to do with this information. In fact, you're always one decision away from making a difference.